In the fall of 1798, 17 people went missing along a 20-mile part of a wild road in southeastern Kentucky. Each person disappeared without leaving any clues behind. They only left their horses and scattered things that didn't tell us what happened to them. What makes these disappearances really scary isn't just how many people vanished, but the fact that the local police deliberately hid every record of what they found out. For over 200 years, the truth about the Hardin family farm stayed hidden in sealed court papers until a county clerk found them in 1987. This discovery showed the most disturbing case of planned murder in early American frontier history. The papers describe a killing operation so well planned and so perfectly disguised as Christian charity that it worked for 8 years without anyone finding out. Before we continue with the story of the farm that became Kentucky's first house of horrors, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. We're about to uncover secrets that powerful families tried to keep buried forever. And tell us in the comments, what state are you listening from? We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers. The discovery that would finally expose the Hardin family's crimes began not with screams in the night, but with the simple act of cleaning up paperwork in a dusty courthouse basement. Southeastern Kentucky in 1798 was a land caught between civilization and wilderness, where the promise of good times drew thousands westward along dangerous mountain paths. The wilderness road carved through the Cumberland Gap by Daniel Boone 20 years earlier had become the main road for settlers moving west from Virginia and the Carolinas. This narrow, winding trail stretched for over 200 miles through some of the most dangerous land in North America, where a single wrong step could mean death from cold weather, wild animals, or the countless human bad guys who haunted the frontier. Along this dangerous path, dozens of small communities had grown like wildflowers after rain. Each one was a beacon of hope for families looking for new beginnings in the untamed frontier. These settlements served as important rest stops where tired travelers could rest, get supplies, and gather information about the dangers that lay ahead. The success or failure of these communities often depended on their ability to provide safe shelter for the constant stream of people who passed through their borders. The township of Millfield sat at an important bend in the road where the trail went down from the rocky ridges into the fertile valley of Beaver Creek. With barely 300 people, it was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, or thought they did. The town had been started in 1794 by a group of Virginia Baptists looking for religious freedom, and their influence could be seen in every part of community life. Sunday services were required for all residents, and the town council enforced strict moral rules that controlled everything from drinking to dancing. The settlement centered around Hendrick's General Store, a weathered log building that served as both trading post and informal courthouse. Jeremiah Hendricks, a gruff former soldier who had fought Indians alongside Daniel Boone himself, ran the place with an iron fist and a keen eye for profit. His store had everything a traveler might need: gunpowder, salt, whiskey, blankets, and the latest news from the civilized world beyond the mountains. Nearby stood the Cumberland Inn, a 2-story building that represented the height of frontier luxury. Martha Crane, the widow who ran the inn, had arrived from Philadelphia 5 years earlier with enough money to build the finest place to stay between Lexington and the Virginia border. Travelers could find a hot meal and a clean bed for 2 bits a night, along with the kind of civilized conversation that reminded them of the world they had left behind. The town's religious center was the New Jerusalem Baptist Church, a modest log building that could hold the entire population during Sunday services. Reverend Ephraim Cole, a Harvard-educated minister who had left a comfortable Boston church for frontier missions, delivered sermons that mixed traditional religion with practical advice for survival in an unforgiving land. His presence gave Millfield a sense of being legitimate that attracted settlers who might otherwise have passed through without stopping. Among Millfield's most respected residents were the Hardins, Ezekiel, his wife Temperance, and their 3 adult children, sons Caleb and Josiah, and daughter Mercy. The family had arrived in the spring of 1791, claiming to be refugees from brutal Indian raids that had destroyed their previous home in eastern Virginia. They quickly established themselves as pillars of the small community, with Ezekiel serving as a lay preacher who helped Reverend Cole and Temperance organizing charity efforts for struggling families who arrived with little more than the clothes on their backs. Ezekiel Hardin was a man who commanded respect through sheer force of personality. Standing well over 6 feet tall with the broad shoulders of a lifetime laborer, he had the kind of physical presence that made other men step aside when he entered a room. His deep voice could fill the church without effort, delivering sermons that moved listeners to tears with their passionate descriptions of divine love and terrible warnings about eternal punishment. Those who heard him preach often remarked that he seemed to speak with the authority of someone who had personally witnessed both heaven and hell. Temperance Hardin was equally impressive in her own way. A small, delicate woman with early gray hair and hands that never seemed to rest. She had quickly become the community's unofficial doctor. Her knowledge of healing herbs was amazing, and she could treat everything from broken bones to difficult births with a skill that seemed almost supernatural. More than one family owed their lives to her midnight visits during times of crisis, and her reputation for medical miracles had spread throughout the county. Their children appeared to be perfect examples of frontier virtue. Caleb, the older son at 26, had his father's impressive physical presence and his mother's gentle manner. He worked the family farm with tireless dedication while finding time to help elderly neighbors with their own crops. Josiah, 24, was smaller but more intellectual, often serving as the community's unofficial schoolmaster during the winter months when farm work slowed. At 22, Mercy was considered one of the most beautiful young women in the county, with a sweet personality that made her popular among both men and women. The Hardin farm sprawled across 400 acres of prime bottomland along Beaver Creek, 3 miles south of town. The land had cost Ezekiel nearly every penny he had, but the investment had proven wise. The rich soil produced abundant crops of corn and tobacco, while the creek provided water for livestock and power for a small grist mill that served the surrounding area. Visitors often remarked on the farm's unusual success, noting that the Hardins seemed to have more wealth than could be explained by farming alone. Ezekiel had built his homestead with careful attention to both comfort and security. The main house was a 2-story log structure with stone chimneys and glass windows, an almost unheard of luxury on the frontier. The rooms were furnished with pieces that seemed far too fine for a simple farming family. Carved chairs, imported china, silver candlesticks, and books that suggested education and refinement. A massive barn could shelter 50 horses, while a network of outbuildings included a smokehouse, dairy, blacksmith shop, and what Ezekiel described as the largest root cellar in the county. What made the Hardins particularly valuable to the community was their willingness to help travelers in distress. The frontier was unforgiving to those who traveled alone or unprepared, and barely a week passed without someone arriving at the farm seeking help. More than once, Ezekiel had ridden out in dangerous weather to help a broken wagon or injured horse, often inviting stranded families to shelter at his farm until repairs could be made. Such hospitality was considered a Christian duty on the frontier, but the Hardins took it to extraordinary lengths. Temperance was particularly known for her willingness to treat injured or sick travelers regardless of their ability to pay. Her medical skills had saved countless lives, and many families continued their journeys only because of her help. She maintained a well-stocked medical room in one of the outbuildings, complete with surgical instruments and medications that most frontier doctors could only dream of having. The family's reputation for hospitality had grown so strong that by 1798, it was common for travelers to specifically look for the Hardin farm when planning their journey. Local guides regularly directed parties toward Beaver Creek, assuring them that the Hardins would provide fair prices for supplies and safe shelter for the night. The family's guest book, which Mercy kept with careful attention to detail, recorded hundreds of visitors over the years, merchants, ministers, families, and single adventurers who had found refuge at the prosperous farm. But in the harsh reality of frontier life, where death lurked behind every tree and trust could be fatal, appearances could be more than deceiving, they could be deadly. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came on October 13, 1798, when a merchant named Samuel Fletcher failed to arrive in Lexington as scheduled. Fletcher was no ordinary traveler. He was one of the most experienced and reliable merchants on the Wilderness Road. A man whose punctuality had made him wealthy in a world where timing could mean the difference between profit and devastating loss. For 12 years, he had made the dangerous journey between Virginia and Kentucky 4 times every year, carrying manufactured goods west and raw materials east. Fletcher's business partner, Thomas Greeley, had worked with the merchant long enough to know his habits very well. Fletcher never changed from his planned schedule without sending word, and he never took unnecessary risks that might put his valuable cargo in danger. When Greeley received no word after 5 days, 2 days beyond Fletcher's promised arrival, he knew something terrible had happened. Greeley's search began at dawn on October 18th, following Fletcher's known route backward from Lexington. He questioned innkeepers, merchants, and farmers along the way, each of whom confirmed that Fletcher had passed through on schedule. The trail remained clear until Greeley reached the area near Millfield, where Fletcher seemed to have simply vanished from existence. The discovery of Fletcher's horse came at noon on the second day of searching. The distinctive bay mare was found grazing loose near Miller's Creek, still wearing its saddle, but showing no signs of injury or distress. The animal appeared well fed and cared for, as if it had been deliberately released rather than abandoned in panic. Most puzzling of all, the horse's bridle had been removed and hung carefully on a nearby tree branch, an act that suggested human help rather than accident. Fletcher's saddlebag stayed intact, containing his trading goods and a leather pouch with nearly $50 in silver coins, a fortune that represented months of dangerous work. The money's presence ruled out simple robbery, the most common explanation for frontier disappearances. Even more disturbing, Fletcher's personal things were scattered in a deliberate line leading away from the road toward the interior woodlands, as if he had been forced to drop them one by one while being dragged from his horse. The local constable, Jacob Winters, was a man uniquely qualified to investigate such mysteries. A former Continental Army sergeant who had served under Anthony Wayne in the Ohio campaigns, Winters had both the investigative skills and the stomach for violence that frontier law enforcement required. He had seen enough death and deception to know that the most obvious explanations were often the most wrong, and Fletcher's disappearance struck him as anything but ordinary. Winters organized a search party within hours of Greeley's report, gathering 12 of Millfield's most capable men for what he knew would be a difficult and potentially dangerous investigation. The searchers included Henrik Johansson, a Swedish immigrant whose tracking skills rivaled those of the local Indians, and Benjamin Stokes, a former bounty hunter who knew every hiding place within 50 miles of town. What the search party discovered defied all rational explanation. Fletcher's trail led clearly toward the Hardin farm, marked by torn fabric caught on thorns and occasional drops of what appeared to be blood. The signs suggested that the merchant had been alive but injured when he left the road, possibly struggling against captors who were forcing him deeper into the wilderness. But at the exact boundary of Hardin property, every trace of Fletcher's passage simply stopped existing. The searchers spent hours examining the area where the trail ended, looking for any sign that might show Fletcher's fate. They found nothing. No disturbed earth, no hidden blood, no evidence of struggle. It was as if Samuel Fletcher had been lifted from the ground by invisible hands and carried away into thin air. Even Henrik Johansson, whose tracking abilities were legendary, admitted defeat when confronted with such a complete absence of evidence. When Winters questioned Ezekiel Hardin about the missing merchant, the patriarch's response was both cooperative and strangely rehearsed. Yes, Fletcher had stopped at the farm on October 13th, arriving just before sunset and asking for directions to a shortcut that would save him a day's travel to Lexington. Ezekiel had warned him against taking unfamiliar trails, especially with valuable goods and winter weather approaching, but Fletcher had insisted on trying the route. The merchant had been polite but hurried, declining Temperance's offer of a hot meal and a warm bed in favor of pressing on while daylight remained. According to Ezekiel, Fletcher had seemed nervous and distracted, constantly checking his saddlebags and looking over his shoulder, as if expecting someone to follow him. When asked about this behavior, Fletcher had mentioned seeing strange men following him since leaving Virginia. but had dismissed Ezekiel's suggestion that he remain at the farm until a larger party could escort him to safety. The last the family had seen of him, Fletcher was riding north toward the ridge country, determined to find his shortcut despite growing darkness and threatening weather. Ezekiel's account was supported in exact detail by his entire family, each member providing identical descriptions of Fletcher's visit. They remembered his urgency, his dismissal of their warnings, even his exact words when declining their hospitality. Temperance recalled that the merchant had complained of stomach problems and had accepted a small bottle of her herbal medicine before leaving. Caleb had offered to escort Fletcher to the ridge trail, but the merchant had refused, claiming that his business was too urgent for delays. Their consistency should have been reassuring to Constable Winters. Instead, it struck him as unnaturally perfect, like a story that had been carefully rehearsed and practiced until every detail was fixed in memory. Real witnesses in Winters' experience always contradicted each other on minor points while agreeing on major ones. The Hardin's account was too polished, too complete, too free of the small inconsistencies that marked genuine testimony. The constable's suspicions deepened when he noticed significant changes in the farm's layout since his last visit several months earlier. A new smokehouse had been built near the main barn, unusually large for a family operation, and constructed with thick stone walls that seemed designed for more than food preservation. Fresh earth surrounded several outbuildings, as if extensive digging projects had recently taken place. Most peculiar of all, the family's root cellar appeared to have been substantially enlarged with new timber supports visible around an entrance that now seemed large enough to accommodate a wagon. When Winters asked about these improvements, Ezekiel explained that the family had enjoyed an exceptionally profitable harvest and had decided to invest in better facilities for storing and processing their crops. The enlarged root cellar was necessary for the increased volume of vegetables and preserved foods they planned to sell in Lexington, while the new smokehouse would allow them to cure meat for both family use and commercial sale. The explanations were reasonable and well delivered. But something in Ezekiel's manner suggested he was choosing his words with unusual care. Most disturbing of all, the family's usual warmth seemed forced during Winters' visit, their famous hospitality carrying an undercurrent of nervous energy that the constable couldn't ignore. Temperance's hands shook slightly as she served coffee, and Mercy kept glancing toward her father, as if seeking approval for every word she spoke. Even Caleb and Josiah, normally confident and outgoing young men, seemed subdued and watchful in ways that suggested they were hiding something significant. But without concrete evidence of wrongdoing, there was little Constable Winters could legally do. Fletcher's case was officially recorded as a probable highway robbery or Indian attack. His name was added to the growing list of frontier casualties that marked the price of westward expansion. The merchant's horse was sold at auction to cover his outstanding debts, and within a month, Samuel Fletcher existed only in the memories of those who had known him. Yet Fletcher's disappearance would prove to be just the beginning of a pattern that would terrorize the Wilderness Road for the next 8 months, transforming a prosperous farming community into a place where travelers whispered warnings and parents kept their children close to home after dark. Throughout the winter of 1798 and into the spring of 1799, the disappearances continued with terrifying regularity that defied all rational explanation. Every 2 to 3 weeks, another traveler would vanish without explanation along the same stretch of road, creating a zone of fear that stretched for nearly 20 miles in every direction from Millfield. The victims varied dramatically in age, wealth, and traveling circumstances. Solitary merchants like Fletcher, small family groups, even heavily armed parties traveling together for mutual protection. What united them was their complete disappearance and the fact that each had been seen heading toward or asking about directions to the Hardin farm before vanishing into the wilderness. Dr. Marcus Cromwell disappeared in November during his journey from Richmond to establish a medical practice in Louisville. The 43-year-old physician had been carrying his entire life's work in the form of medical instruments, books, and supplies worth over $300, an investment that represented years of saving and planning. His wagon had been found overturned near Devil's Fork, 3 miles from the Hardin farm, with the contents scattered, but apparently untouched. Local authorities assumed that Cromwell had been thrown from his seat during an accident and had wandered into the wilderness in a state of confusion, eventually dying of exposure. The explanation seemed reasonable until searchers discovered that Cromwell's medical bag was missing from the wreckage. The leather satchel contained surgical instruments of exceptional quality, including a bone saw and amputation kit that would be invaluable to anyone attempting to practice frontier medicine. No wild animal would have taken such items, and ordinary thieves would have been more interested in the coins and trade goods that remained scattered around the crash site. The Henley family vanished in December during one of the worst blizzards in recent memory. Jonathan Henley, his wife Elizabeth, and their 2 young children had been seeking shelter when their wagon became stuck in a snowdrift only half a mile from the Hardin farm. According to Ezekiel's later account, the family had never reached his property despite the short distance, presumably becoming lost in the storm and freezing to death in the wilderness. Their bodies were never found despite extensive searches conducted when the weather cleared. What made the Henley case particularly disturbing was the discovery of their wagon a week after the storm. The vehicle had been pulled from the snowdrift and abandoned beside the road, cleaned of snow, and apparently searched thoroughly. The family's clothing and personal belongings were gone, but their food supplies and tools remained untouched. Most puzzling of all, tracks around the wagon suggested that multiple people had worked together to free it from the drift, an act that would have required considerable time and effort in dangerous weather. January brought the disappearance of Reverend Nathan Cross, a circuit preacher carrying donations for a new church in Frankfurt. Cross was known throughout the region for his powerful sermons and his fearless travels through even the most dangerous areas of the frontier. The 50-year-old minister had survived Indian attacks, bandits, and countless natural hazards during 15 years of preaching, making his disappearance particularly shocking to communities that had come to view him as indestructible. Cross's horse was found 3 days after his disappearance, still carrying saddlebags that contained nearly $200 in church donations. The money's presence ruled out robbery as a motive, but raised disturbing questions about what kind of threat could have overcome such an experienced and resourceful man. Local authorities eventually concluded that Cross had suffered a heart attack or stroke while traveling, falling from his horse and dying somewhere in the vast wilderness that surrounded the Wilderness Road. Each disappearance followed the same inexplicable pattern: abandoned horses found grazing loose or tied to trees, scattered personal belongings suggesting sudden violence or struggle, and trails that led inevitably toward Hardin property before vanishing completely. Yet, whenever questioned by increasingly suspicious authorities, the Hardin family presented plausible explanations that were impossible to disprove. They had seen some of the travelers, yes, but only briefly and usually from a distance. Each victim had been warned about various dangers, bad weather, difficult terrain, reports of bandit activity, but had chosen to continue their journey despite the family's concerned advice. In several cases, the Hardins had offered food, shelter, or escort services that had been politely declined by travelers who seemed determined to maintain their schedules regardless of risk. Constable Winters found himself trapped in an impossible situation that grew more frustrating with each new disappearance. The Hardins were among the most respected families in the county, their reputation for charity and Christian virtue unquestioned by everyone except him. Ezekiel's sermons continued to draw crowds from surrounding townships, his passionate delivery and biblical knowledge impressing even educated ministers like Reverend Cole. Temperance's medical skills had saved dozens of lives during the previous summer's fever outbreak, earning her a reputation that bordered on sainthood among grateful families. To accuse such pillars of the community without ironclad proof would be professional suicide and social ostracism. Winters had seen what happened to lawmen who made accusations they couldn't prove. They found themselves friendless, unemployed, and sometimes facing charges of their own. The frontier operated on a complex web of personal relationships and mutual obligations, and attacking the wrong family could destroy a man's life more effectively than any legal proceeding. Moreover, the family's explanations, while consistently convenient, were entirely believable within the context of frontier life. The wilderness road was genuinely dangerous, plagued by bandits, hostile Indians, severe weather, and the countless natural hazards that claimed lives regularly. Dozens of travelers disappeared each year under circumstances far less mysterious than those surrounding the Hardin farm. What made this cluster of vanishings different was purely statistical. Too many people, too close together, all last seen in the same general area. But statistics meant little in a world where evidence was everything, and evidence seemed to evaporate like morning mist whenever investigators approached the Hardin property. The family welcomed searches of their buildings and grounds, answered questions with apparent openness, and even provided volunteers for search parties that combed the surrounding wilderness for signs of the missing travelers. Their cooperation was so complete and enthusiastic that it felt almost like mockery to the increasingly frustrated constable. The first crack in the family's carefully maintained facade came from an unexpected source: 9-year-old Timothy Vaughn, whose family lived on a small homestead 2 miles east of the Hardin farm. Timothy was known throughout the community as an imaginative child who loved to explore the woods around his family's property, often returning home with elaborate stories about the wildlife and natural wonders he had discovered during his adventures. In March 1799, young Timothy approached Constable Winters with a story that initially seemed like another product of childish imagination. The boy claimed he had been exploring the woods near Beaver Creek when he heard screaming coming from the direction of the Hardin farm. But these weren't the kind of screams that came from accidents, arguments, or even childbirth. They were the sustained, desperate cries of someone in mortal terror, rising and falling in patterns that suggested both physical pain and psychological torment. According to Timothy, he had heard such sounds at least 5 times over the winter, always during the darkest hours of night, when decent folk should be asleep. The screaming would continue for what seemed like hours, sometimes accompanied by other sounds that the boy couldn't identify: rhythmic hammering, the creak of pulleys or ropes, and occasionally what sounded like multiple voices chanting in unison. The sounds always ended abruptly, followed by a silence so complete that Timothy wondered if he had imagined the entire episode. When Winters questioned the boy's parents, they admitted to hearing strange sounds themselves, but had dismissed them as natural phenomena common to frontier life, animal calls distorted by wind and distance perhaps, or the sounds of nocturnal predators hunting in the wilderness. After all, the Hardins were good Christian folk who had never given anyone cause for suspicion. What possible explanation could there be for screaming in the night coming from such a respectable household? Timothy's account might have been dismissed as childhood imagination or misinterpreted natural sounds, except for one detail that gave Constable Winters considerable pause. When pressed for specifics, the boy could accurately describe the approximate dates when he had heard the screaming, and each corresponded exactly with the estimated time of a traveler's disappearance. The correlation was too precise to be coincidental, too consistent to be explained by chance. Armed with Timothy Vaughn's disturbing testimony, Constable Winters began to build a case against the Hardin family with the methodical patience of a man who understood that accusations against such prominent citizens would require absolutely unassailable proof. He started by quietly interviewing other neighbors who lived within hearing distance of the farm, asking carefully worded questions that wouldn't reveal his growing suspicions or alert the Hardins to his investigation. What emerged from these discreet inquiries was a disturbing pattern of small inconsistencies and unexplained phenomena that had been overlooked, dismissed, or rationalized away by people who trusted the family's reputation more than their own observations. Each piece of evidence was minor when considered individually, but together they painted a picture that made Winters' blood run cold. Sarah Mitchell, whose small farm lay closest to the Hardin property, recalled several nights when she had seen unusual activity at their homestead, lanterns moving between buildings at hours when decent folk should be sleeping. The sounds of digging and heavy construction that seemed to continue until dawn. When she had mentioned these observations to Temperance Hardin after church services, the woman had offered a reasonable explanation. The family was working on extensive improvements to their root cellar and other storage facilities. And they preferred to do such labor during cool night hours rather than waste precious daylight that could be spent tending crops. The explanation had satisfied Sarah at the time, but in retrospect, she realized that the nighttime construction had continued for months longer than any reasonable building project would require. Moreover, she had never seen evidence of the massive amounts of excavated earth that such extensive digging should have produced. When pressed by Winters for more details, Sarah admitted that the sounds had often been accompanied by what seemed like muffled voices, and occasionally what might have been cries of pain or distress. Old Henrik Johansson, whose farm bordered the Hardin property to the north, reported findings that were even more troubling. The Swedish immigrant, whose tracking and hunting skills were legendary throughout the county, had discovered animal bones scattered along their shared fence line. Not the normal remains of butchered livestock, but bones that had been cracked, gnawed, and processed in ways that suggested something far more sinister than ordinary farming activities. The bones included skulls and long bones from horses, cattle, and pigs, but also smaller fragments that Johansson couldn't identify despite his extensive knowledge of local wildlife. Most disturbing of all, some of the bones showed evidence of being deliberately broken with tools, while others bore saw marks that suggested systematic dismemberment rather than natural decomposition or predator activity. When Johansson had approached Ezekiel about the mysterious bone deposits, the patriarch had offered a plausible but somehow unsatisfying explanation. Wild animals had been particularly troublesome that winter, he claimed, forcing the family to dispose of several diseased livestock carcasses by scattering the remains throughout the woods. The bone fragments were simply the result of scavengers and whether breaking down these disposed carcasses over time. But Johansson's trained eye had noticed details that contradicted this innocent explanation. The bones were too clean, too systematically processed, and too widely distributed to be the result of natural decomposition. Moreover, many of the fragments showed evidence of being boiled or otherwise treated with heat, suggesting deliberate processing rather than simple disposal of diseased animals. Most tellingly, several neighbors reported dramatic changes in the Hardin family's behavior and demeanor over the past year. The children, once friendly and outgoing members of the community, had become withdrawn and secretive, avoiding social gatherings, and speaking only when directly addressed. Caleb and Josiah, who had previously been popular among young people their age, now seemed nervous and distracted during public interactions, as if constantly preoccupied with private concerns. Mercy Hardin's transformation was particularly striking. The young woman, who had once been considered one of the most beautiful and vivacious girls in the county, now appeared haggard and prematurely aged, her face carrying a haunted expression that made people uncomfortable. She had stopped attending social functions entirely, and when she did appear in public, she seemed to shrink from human contact as if afraid of revealing some terrible secret. Even Ezekiel's sermons had taken on a darker tone over the past months, dwelling obsessively on themes of divine judgment, the punishment of sinners, and the necessity of eliminating evil from the world. Where his preaching had once emphasized God's love and mercy, it now focused almost exclusively on wrath and retribution. Several church members had privately expressed concern about the increasingly violent imagery in his biblical interpretations. Constable Winters also discovered disturbing gaps in the Hardin family's background story that raised serious questions about their true identity and origins. While they claimed to be refugees from Indian raids in eastern Virginia, no one had been able to verify their previous residence or confirm the specific attacks that had supposedly driven them westward. Winter's inquiries to authorities in Virginia had produced no records of any Hardin family being affected by Indian violence in the time period they claimed. Moreover, the family's arrival in Kentucky seemed to mark the beginning of their documented existence, as if the Hardins had materialized from nothing in the spring of 1791. They possessed no letters from relatives, no business records from their previous life, no personal effects that predated their appearance in Millfield. For a family claiming to have lost everything to Indian raids, they had managed to arrive in Kentucky with substantial financial resources and an impressive collection of household goods. The constable's investigation received an unexpected and alarming boost in April 1799 when a traveling peddler named Isaac Brewster arrived in Millfield with information that transformed suspicion into near certainty. Brewster was a well-known figure throughout the frontier, a man whose business required him to travel constantly between settlements, and who possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of events and personalities throughout the region. Brewster had spent the previous winter in eastern Tennessee, where he had heard disturbing stories about a series of disappearances that had plagued the Holston River Valley between 1789 and 1791. According to local accounts, at least 15 travelers had vanished along a remote stretch of road near a prosperous farm operated by a family named Harper, Zachariah Harper, his wife Prudence, and their 3 adult children. The similarities between the Tennessee disappearances and the current Kentucky cases were so striking that they couldn't possibly be coincidental. The pattern was identical. Travelers would be seen heading toward the Harper property and would simply vanish, leaving behind only scattered belongings and abandoned horses. Local authorities had suspected the family, but had never been able to prove their involvement, hampered by the same lack of physical evidence that was frustrating Winter's current investigation. Even more chilling were Brewster's descriptions of the Harper family themselves. Zechariah was a lay preacher known for his powerful sermons and charitable works, while Prudence was respected throughout the region for her exceptional healing abilities. They had arrived in the valley claiming to be refugees from Indian raids with no verifiable history before their sudden appearance. The family was known for their hospitality to travelers and had built a reputation as pillars of their community. When Brewster described the physical appearance of the Harper family, Winters felt his blood turn to ice water. Zachariah Harper had been a tall, imposing man with prematurely gray hair and penetrating eyes. Prudence was small and delicate with skilled hands and an extensive knowledge of medicinal herbs. Their children matched the ages and descriptions of Caleb, Josiah, and Mercy Hardin so closely that they could have been the same people. Most damning of all, the Harper family had vanished overnight in the spring of 1791, abandoning their farm and disappearing without explanation. Just as suspicion about the disappearances was beginning to focus on their property. Neighbors had found the homestead deserted with signs of hasty departure and deliberate destruction. Buildings had been partially burned, wells had been filled with rocks and debris, and the entire farm showed evidence of systematic elimination of anything that might provide clues to the family's true identity or activities. When Tennessee authorities had finally obtained warrants to search the abandoned Harper property, they had made discoveries that still haunted the investigators who participated. Hidden throughout the woods surrounding the farm were dozens of shallow graves containing the remains of both animals and humans. The human remains included personal effects belonging to several of the missing travelers, creating undeniable evidence that the Harper family had been responsible for multiple murders. But by then, the killers had vanished completely, leaving behind only their crimes and the mystery of their true identities. A 6-month manhunt had failed to locate any trace of the Harper family, and the case had eventually been closed with the assumption that they had either died in the wilderness or fled to territories beyond the reach of American law. The implications of Brewster's revelations were staggering and terrifying. If his account was accurate, the Hardin family were not merely local criminals who had committed a few opportunistic murders. They were experienced serial killers who had perfected their methods over years of practice, moving from region to region when suspicion grew too strong and leaving behind a trail of bodies that stretched across multiple states. Even worse, their current operation in Kentucky appeared to be far more sophisticated and successful than their previous activities in Tennessee. They had learned from their mistakes, developed better methods of disposing of evidence, and created a more convincing cover identity that had allowed them to operate undetected for 8 years. The number of victims in Kentucky likely far exceeded those in Tennessee, representing one of the most extensive killing sprees in American criminal history. The weight of Isaac Brewster's testimony pressed down on Constable Winters like a physical burden, but he knew that compelling as the evidence might be, it would not be sufficient to secure convictions against the Hardin family in a court of law. Frontier justice moved deliberately. and judges required ironclad physical evidence before authorizing arrests that could destroy innocent lives and tear apart established communities. The constable needed proof that would stand up under the scrutiny of skeptical attorneys and suspicious juries, evidence that could not be explained away or dismissed as coincidence. The breakthrough he desperately needed came from the last source he would have expected, Mercy Hardin herself. On the night of May 22, 1799, the 22-year-old woman appeared at Winter's cabin like a ghost materializing from the darkness, her face streaked with tears and her hands trembling with barely controlled terror. What she told him during the next 3 hours would finally expose the full horror of what had been happening at the Hardin farm and provide the evidence necessary to bring Kentucky's most notorious family of killers to justice. According to Mercy's devastating confession, her family had been systematically murdering travelers for over 8 years, beginning just months after their arrival in Kentucky. But what made her testimony truly horrifying was not just the scope of their crimes, but the methodical, almost ritualistic way in which the murders had been planned and executed. The killing operation, as Mercy described it, was far more sophisticated than Winters had imagined possible. Her father Ezekiel had convinced the family that they were carrying out God's work by eliminating what he called unworthy souls who traveled the frontier roads. The murders weren't random acts of violence driven by greed or opportunity, but carefully planned executions that served both what Ezekiel claimed was divine justice and the family's increasingly elaborate material needs. The process began with what the family called evaluation. When promising targets approached the farm, travelers with valuable goods, significant amounts of money, or skills that the family coveted, Ezekiel would engage.